afternoon, everyone. My name's Rebecca Huntley, and I describe myself as a writer, a researcher, and a mum. Other people would describe me as that chick with the big hair, that chick we hear on the radio all the time, or that kind of most hateful term, social commentator. But what I really am is a social researcher. But in terms of what I do every day, I almost see myself as a professional eavesdropper. It's my job to find out what Australians are thinking and feeling about pretty much anything. And the way I do that is I go into people's homes, I sit in their kitchens, their lounge rooms, their backyards and their sheds, and I listen to them talk about their lives. And then I take that information back to my team of researchers who've been doing exactly what I've been doing. And we take all those kitchen table conversations and we craft a story, and we tell that story to clients, and sometimes we tell it to the media. I think it's one of the more interesting jobs in Australia, being a megaphone for the Australian consumer. And you probably noticed that everybody else is interested in public opinion research as well, even at the same time as we're becoming all the more critical of that research, how it's conducted and how it's used. I think we're all fascinated about whether we're in the minority or the majority on a particular issue, and we all love to be comforted or outraged by the opinions of others. Anyway, a couple of years ago, I was presenting my research to a client, and I was asked a question that I couldn't answer immediately. And when I present our research to clients, I would use the term consumer probably 20 or 30 times. Consumers are worried about cost of living, consumers are worried about interest rates, consumers are worried about superannuation laws. Anyway, at the end of this presentation, this guy got up and he said, look, you use the term consumer a lot. Do people really describe themselves as consumers? Do they really connect with that label? It was a great question, and I couldn't answer it straight away, but I did think about it and I said, look, people don't connect with that term consumer. They don't really identify with the label. And the question made me go back to look at all the research that I've been involved in the last 6 years to find if there were any other terms other than consumer that people connected with, and I couldn't really find any. If pressed, people identify as being part of the middle class, but we all know that that term is now so big, it encompasses so many different kinds of people at different income levels that it almost becomes meaningless. I have never conducted a group in which people call themselves battlers. It might be surprising to you, but people who live in Western Sydney don't describe themselves as people who live in Western Sydney, and people who live in the electorate of Lindsay do not describe themselves as the all-important voters of Lindsay. Sometimes people use the term ordinary Australians. If you do a group with a lot of people who are wealthy, they describe themselves as not rich, which means that they are rich. Sometimes people identify as being part of a generational cohort, but in the same time they say, well, I might be Generation Y, but I can live without Facebook for a day and I don't live off my parents. People don't like those terms either. During election times, people might describe themselves as voters, but never as citizens. And when they're really angry, they describe themselves as taxpayers. Even a really broad term like Australians is subject to question. A couple of years ago, I did a research report on Australian identity. And we asked people, what is unique about being Australian? And they couldn't really pin it down. They recognised that all the traits that we associate with Australianness, love of the outdoors, love of a beer, love of sport, all of that exists in other cultures. The only two things that they could really identify were uniquely Australian, koalas and Medicare. So, we know that people don't identify with these labels, consumer or voter or battler. We also know they hate being marketed to through these labels as well. You talk to women about Facebook and they say, look, just because I put a couple of pictures of my kids up on Facebook doesn't mean I'm only interested in pelvic floor exercises and nappies, rather than, let's say, skydiving. We all hate the term working families, don't we? Even working families. I've sat in groups of older parents with older kids in their late teens and early 20s, and they don't think that term applies to them. They think it applies to younger parents with primary school age kids. So, we know that people don't identify strongly with these labels. Why is that the case? Well, it has to be because we are so much smarter about how marketing works. And even though marketing techniques are becoming a lot more sophisticated, particularly in the age of big data, Marketing appeals fail, and when they fail, people are absolutely scathing of them because they recognise how they operate. We feel like we can see through the shiny images to the cogs grinding behind them. Now, I'm part of an industry that helps those cogs grind. My job is to get lots of information about people, generalise about them, aggregate, classify. And I do that, and I get paid not as well as I should for it, but I hope that while doing it, I never lose sight of its limitations, that I never lose sight that it's a problematic process, that it's difficult, and it often fails. So thinking about the problems with these kinds of labels has made me also think about a little bit about how people in my group see themselves as the same or different to other people. And I've come to a certain conclusion. A lot of the time, people are looking for differences. They may hate being labelled, but they love labelling other people. And I want to share with you a couple of little quotes from our groups that I've done in the last couple of years. This one I love. We're very homogenous here in Northcote. We are politically. You go down to Narre-Warren and it's just a different world. People who live in different areas, their problems are different. They don't have time for that community spirit. And this is my favourite. When we were single, all the hot boys were in Warilla. We had to leave Albion Park to find the hot boys. And there are the hot boys in Albion Park. Anyway, so all of those kinds of perceptions around difference are very much based on perception rather than experience. But my experience, listening to thousands of Australians in hundreds of groups over many years, is that these differences are largely marginal. The group in Narre-Warren are just as concerned about cost of living, the rising price of petrol, just as confused about climate change as the group in Northcote. The group in Bondi are just as worried about extreme weather events, just as annoyed at the federal government, and just as in love with my kitchen rules as the group in Bankstown. And the group and the boys in Warilla are just as hot as the boys in Albion Park, but I say that from perception rather than personal experience. So, this is actually quite a shocking thing for me to say, that the differences between Australians are overstated. And it's shocking because I went to university in the 1990s and it was all about difference. You couldn't stand up in a political meeting, you couldn't stand up in a tutorial without saying, I'm Rebecca Huntley and I'm a bourgeois, straight, middle-class, able-bodied woman and this is what I think. And it's not that that was a problem. You know, we had to work through the way in which our identity and experience really shaped our worldview. We had to also recognise how the universal was often partial. It was often the view of the dominant group, either ignoring the voices of others or speaking on behalf of others. But in the work I do, I listen to all kinds of voices. They're the voices in my head, arguing but also agreeing about what's important to them. Love, security, a home, meaningful work that doesn't undermine your health and happiness, concern about the future, belief that it's not going to be as good as the present, even stronger belief that it won't be as good if we have the kinds of politicians that we have now. So this work has changed me. It's turned me from somebody focused on difference to somebody looking for connections. I think a little bit too about this whole concept of connection as well, which leads me to think about belonging. And about 3 years ago, researchers were all having an argument about if people had a choice between being considered likeable or interesting, what they would choose. And because we work for a research company, we were able to put this question to a nationally representative poll of 1,000 Australians. And the results were interesting. Only 30% of people wanted to be interesting, 65% would rather be considered likeable. And I don't know what that other 5% without a moustache want. There's a whole other research report there. So what does that tell me? It tells me that the need to belong, the desire to belong, is so much more important than the desire to stand out from the crowd. So I think now more than ever, it's so important for us to find a way to pull together our common causes, to address our shared fears, to break down the kinds of false divisions that we create between people that get in the way of communication and understanding. That requires a certain generosity in our language, a certain poetry that we don't find a lot, a certain commitment to the language of inclusion, a certain resistance to the desire to slice up the community into interest groups and niches, and a complete rejection of the weasel words that have infiltrated not just marketing and advertising, but so much of public language, the way that politicians speak to us and the way the media reports on them. It requires a certain commitment to we over me and them. If you look at the great speeches, the ones that have endured throughout generations, they use the word we liberally. In some speeches, we starts every single sentence. We are met on a great battlefield of war. We shall fight on the beaches. We took the children from their mothers. A commitment to we rather than me and them or those guys in the focus group on Thursday. And in the examples I've given you, we encompasses a nation of millions of people. It can encompass a nation of millions of people. But it can also embrace a smaller community, but it can never be narrow. It's not a question of how many people are involved, but the spirit of that involvement. We reaches out and creates connections between people who on the surface consider themselves to be different. Because I'm telling you, no matter how different we think we are from the guy in the next suburb or the woman behind us in the checkout queue at the supermarket or the guy that just arrived in Australia on a leaky boat, I realise now that we are all in this together. Thank you.